Welcome, rad friends, one and all, to this week's message from Adam that I am commanded to share. The wasteland is no stranger to radiation. After the Great War, the wasteland was covered in Adam's holy glow, but even before the Great War, there was a concerning amount of radioactive waste. Throughout the games, we have encountered radiation so intense, mere minutes or even seconds are enough to send us to the great vault above. Here we look at the most radioactive locations within the entire series, across as many of the Fallout games as we can, and rank them in ascending order, starting with the least radioactive and working our way to the number one spot, which is the most radioactive spot in the whole franchise. So crank up those rads, and I better not see you popping any Rad-X or Radaway, as things get toasty in the most irradiated locations in Fallout. First on the list, but dead last in the rankings, is the most radioactive location in Fallout 2, and it is the Gecko nuclear plant. Or rather, the official name is the Poseidon Oil Reactor 5, but that name kinda makes it sound like an oil power plant rather than a nuclear one. It makes sense that a nuclear reactor would be the most radioactive place in Fallout 2, but it is especially so because the reactor is not running very efficiently. Although it is functioning, it needs some work to get it into tip-top shape, and most importantly, it needs a new hydroelectric magnetosphere regulator. Shockingly, someone doesn't have such a common item kicking around in their garage, and the only known place that has one is Vault City. Only problem is, Vault City freaking hates ghouls. But to be fair, they hate everyone that isn't them. Once you get the part, it's super easy to fix. You just need to amplify the plutonium gamma shield, deharmonize the Neptune impeller, calibrate the uranium rod driver, set the voltage on the Saturn-class capacitor, test the Jupiter wave compiler, and lastly, install the regulator that you hopefully stole from Vault City. You got all that? Or instead of doing all of that, just program the helper robot to do it, because the area right outside of the reactor is Fallout 2's most radioactive location. The amount of radiation can only be measured if you are equipped with a Geiger counter, of which there are several possible ones that can be bought or stolen in the wasteland. But make sure its battery isn't dead or it won't be any help at all. You can only get a reading when it is equipped and only when activated. It gives one reading, which is how much radiation is in the chosen one's body at that exact moment. That is quite a bit different from later games, where the Geiger counter is incorporated into the Pip-Boy and gives a real-time readout of how radioactive the current environment is, as well as the player's overall radiation level. This also means that the Geiger counter gives us measurements in REMs instead of rads, and this makes for an interesting difference. Rads measure how much energy from radiation is deposited into something. For example, water or organics. REMs measure the dose of radiation that a person receives. And lucky for us, in most instances, the conversion from rad to REM is 1-for-1. One of the exceptions is if the radiation source is alpha radiation. Then the rad to REM conversion is not 1-to-1, but it's between 1-to-10 and 1-to-20. Alpha radiation is simply far more damaging if it manages to make it into the body, so when converting the REM values in Fallout 2 to rads, I will take that into account as well. Lastly, the radiation values that we get in later games are rads per second, but there isn't a good way to measure REMs per second in Fallout 1 or 2, so I take a reading with the Geiger counter, then wait in the Pip-Boy for 1 hour, and measure directly afterward. Then I convert that value into REMs per second. Alright, so with all that fun stuff out of the way, and against all the advice from the ghouls that are working in the Gecko nuclear power plant, I stepped into the blistering reactor area. With no Rad-X, no radiation blocking clothing or armor, and my radiation resistance set to 0 with an endurance of 1, the amount of radiation I encounter is the most I can possibly absorb. In between 1 hour waits, I encountered 30 REMs, and this went until the chosen one died, but it wasn't because of radiation. In addition to radiation damage, you will also receive normal damage, and that is actually what killed me dead. 30 REMs per hour converts to a maximum of 0.00 rads per second, or if all the radiation was alpha radiation, which it probably wasn't, then it would be 0.0004 rads per second at the minimum. That's, well, not a lot, at least when compared to the other games. The amount of time in-game that it takes to die from radiation takes actually quite a long time. I waited over 4 days in this location before I ran out of stim packs and died from HP loss rather than radiation accumulation, so it takes days of hanging out in here to kill the chosen one, which might be fairly close to what it would be in real life based on the radiation levels. I also wanted to compare what the real life effects would be based on these radiation levels, and there are a few details here. Rads and rems aren't actually the units of measurement that we use for radiation anymore. Rather, most often we use grays and sieverts. I do think using the older terms, rads and rems in the games, are appropriate for Fallout though, given the retrofuturism that is so heavily represented. Plus, Gray King and Sievert King just don't have the same ring to it. 1 gray is 100 rems, and chilling in the reactor room for an hour getting dosed with 30 rems would expose you to 0.3 grays. Based on some acute radiation syndrome charts, this is an amount that would have no obvious immediate or latent effects, with a possibility of a long-term effect being minor blood changes or reduced appetite. I do have an honorable mention for a very irradiated location in Fallout 2, and that is the Toxic Dump Special Encounter, where the map is filled with radioactive waste and geckos. And if you want to snack on something that will fill you with glorious rads, fruit is the only consumable in-game that will fit the bill. Okay, so 0.00 rads per second is less radiation than drinking just a normal Nuka-Cola in Fallout 3, so everything has got to be up from here. The glow in the first Fallout is infamous throughout the California wasteland for being the most radioactive location, and indeed, it is the deadliest place in the first Fallout, at least with respect to radiation. Truth be told, there are not really any other locations with large-scale radiation in the whole game, so it kind of wins by default, but at least it is more radioactive than anywhere in Fallout 2. You have to travel over a very large distance to get to the center of the glow, which was a fortified West Tech research facility that drew the attention of the Chinese bombs. Because it takes a good deal of time to travel in the overworld from the edge of the glow to the center, it is a good idea to bring some Rad-X and Radaway. But since I'm doing this for science, I once again had 0 rad resistance, 1 endurance, and no radiation resistant clothing or chems. Standing at the center of the glow, I first measured how many rems the Vault Dweller accumulated from standing at the bombed out entrance of the West Tech facility, which ended up being a hefty 1,845 rems. That makes the nuclear reactor in Fallout 2 just look so pathetic. I wanted to test each floor in the facility, and I was able to go down to the first level and wait for an hour, and the first level is less radioactive at just 1,230 rems per hour. None of the other levels of the West Tech facility will allow you to rest, so I couldn't test every level, but level 4 has the Zax supercomputer. If you challenge Zax to a chess match, 2 hours will elapse. I just checked my radiation levels before playing chess, looked at them after playing chess, and took into account that 2 hours had passed instead of only 1. Level 4 had the lowest radiation levels of the other 2 locations, and I have to say, intuitively, this makes sense. I would have expected to encounter less and less radiation as we go deeper into the facility, as there is a good chance that the walls, floors, doors, and other barriers would have kept radiation from penetrating farther into the facility. So let's look at the highest reading of 1,845 rems per hour on the surface. That is about 0.5 rads per second, or if all the radiation were alpha radiation, which it assuredly isn't, but I'm just doing due diligence, it would be a minimum of 0.03 rads per second. 1,845 rems in an hour would be 18.45 grays, which would put you in some very bad territory, at least for all of you not endowed with Adam's blessing. The immediate effects would be nausea in 5 minutes or less, and latent effects are pretty horrific. Diarrhea, gastrointestinal bleeding, and rapid cell death will occur, but the body will often then enter a phase called the walking ghost phase, where all symptoms will kind of go away and energy levels will go back up, almost like you're recovering. However, this will only last at most 2 weeks, where the terminal phase begins and the exposed person gets a high fever, falls into a coma, and will die within a week. In game, you can only stand at the entrance for about 21 hours with no radiation protection before the Vault Dweller succumbs to acute radiation syndrome, which again is probably not far off from real life at those radiation levels. So even though the glow ain't playing around, there are 4 more games with radioactive locations that make this look like just eating a banana. And speaking of fruit, in Fallout 1, fruit is once again the only radioactive consumable in the whole game. Third from the bottom, do you know which game has the next most irradiated location? Yes, it is the one, the only, Fallout New Vegas. It's funny how the 3 Interplay/Obsidian games were all at the bottom of the list. Well, I guess I haven't mentioned Fallout Tactics, and I might as well state right here that it actually won't be on the list, mostly because there are once again very few locations with a bunch of background radiation, but also because there's no way to measure the radiation amounts in-game because the Geiger counter was cut. The only way to know that you're irradiated is to see if a team member starts getting penalties to their special stats. And that reminds me of another thing. The first 3 games, Fallout, Fallout 2, and Tactics, all use the term radiated when the player gets a significant amount of radiation, but the term should be irradiated. Interplay, what sillies. Forgive the tangent, back to the Mojave. Since Fallout New Vegas uses Fallout 3's engine, as well as a lot of the same assets and systems, the way the radiation is detected and shown to the player is the same new system that Fallout 3 introduced. The Geiger counter provides constant real-time feedback to the player, displaying the amount of radiation in an area or the amount ingested when ingesting a consumable or chem. This is displayed in rads per second, so we get some really good granular results to find the precise location of the most radioactive areas of the wasteland. Of many irradiated places in the Mojave, do you know where you can bask in more of Adam's glow than any other? It is the location of dry wells, which is only reachable by the courier after the events of the Lonesome Road DLC, and only if the courier chose to aim and fire the nukes at the Legion. Dry Wells is a Legion camp south from Cottonwood Cove along the banks of the Colorado River, and this location had significance to Ulysses, the protagonist of the DLC. It was part of the territory of his old tribe, the Twisted Hairs, before the tribe was destroyed and assimilated into the Legion. So what I'm trying to get at is that the Legion freaking deserved it. The location itself is just destroyed buildings, random fires, a smoky haze, and at the very end of the area, a crater from nuclear detonation. The courier has to fight their way to the crater, fighting brutally difficult, irradiated legionaries, and eventually facing off against Gaius Magnus, the centurion that commanded the Legion forces in this area right before they met the might of Atom. The crater is, unsurprisingly, the hotspot for the radiation in this area, and there is a strange effect where the screen will dim to black when entering the crater, although after several seconds the dimming effect will go away entirely. I measured 240 rads per second at the center of the crater, but if you toggle collision off and go into the air above the crater a little bit, you can find a max level of 308 rads per second. And again, this is with a character that doesn't have any radiation resistant armor, clothing, or perks. 308 rads per second could be either 300 rems or as high as 6,160 rems if it is all alpha radiation going straight into our veins. And that's a very large spread. Converting these values works out to a range of 0.31 to 61.6 grays per second. So 1 single second of exposure could vary between no immediate effect or nearly instant coma and disorientation. Using just the conservative 0.31 gray measurement at these radiation levels, it would only take 1 minute of exposure before the long-term prognosis would be certain death in 1 week or less, and 4.5 minutes of exposure at this level would cross the 80 gray cutoff, where it is theorized that instant unconsciousness and death within 24 hours would occur. That is one spicy meatball. Standing at the center of the crater with no radiation protection will kill you dead in 4 seconds flat, which is really fast, and is also faster than what would happen in real life. Some honorable mentions from Fallout New Vegas are the Courier's Mile, another location that can be nuked through the Lonesome Road DLC, but the peak radiation here isn't even close to Drywell's, sitting in the 20s. Likewise, the crater at the Long 15, which is the site where the nukes bomb NCR positions, is only around 20 rads per second at the most. Interestingly, the only place most people think of in New Vegas when intense radiation is mentioned is Camp Searchlight, which is unique because it was a position held by the NCR until a covert sabotage mission by the Legion uncorked some pre-war nuclear waste that had been sitting in the fire station for centuries. This quickly irradiated the entire area, killing many NCR personnel, ghoulifying many others, but the max radiation I found here was in the fire station at around 18 rads per second. This does make it the most irradiated spot in the base game, but it is a far cry from what we see elsewhere. Camp Searchlight is also the spot with the most irradiated consumables, all of which dose the player with 10 rads per item. So go ahead and enjoy these refreshing beverages if these radioactive places just aren't quite doing it for you. So we have made it to third place. What is the third most radioactive place in the whole game? Kinda, sorta, not really. Well, we have to travel to Appalachia to find it, and go back in time to only decades after the Great War, to a place known as the Emmett Mountain Disposal Site. The radiation and radioactive containers outside of the disposal site gives us a hint as to what we will be encountering inside, where things are so much worse. This disposal site was operated by the Department of Energy and chosen specifically due to its geology as a place to hide away hundreds of barrels filled with some of the most dangerous radioactive waste imaginable. In true Fallout fashion, the construction efforts were shoddy, cutting corners and using inferior materials. This resulted in a partial collapse of some of the underground portions of the disposal site, trapping 2 workers and crushing the barrels holding the nuclear waste. This disaster led to the leaching of radioactive material into the groundwater and a temporary suspension of work as the site was sealed off. The crew in charge of the site got almost zero assistance, although they had an environmental disaster on their hands, and the only doctors sent to monitor the workers seemed less interested in treating any potential exposure and instead more interested in gathering information on what effects the personnel were experiencing due to the radiation. Supervisor after supervisor would suddenly go missing after they tried going to Washington, D.C. themselves to try and get answers as to why they were just being left out to dry. After the war, the facility, unsurprisingly, became infested with ghouls around the exterior, and after the release of the Wastelanders update, has become a hotbed of scavengers and others who are trying to mine the irradiated ore. You know what they say, one man's bone-rotting environmental disaster is another man's livelihood, or something. Going inside, there are a few places where there isn't at least a little bit of radiation, and so plenty of Rad-X, Radaway, and radiation-resistant clothing is a must for exploring in any great amount. Or you can just do what I did and spam the hotkey for Radaway until I break my freaking keyboard. The highest levels of radiation are near the end of each disposal area, of which there are 4 that are explorable. Their peak radiation numbers were all around the same, so there isn't one that stands out from the rest, but the highest radiation seemed to consistently be right before you get to the end, which I kind of found surprising. I had guessed that the most radioactive spots would be at the very end. You can find areas with 600 rads per second with a peak of 623. Converting that to grays per second, it would be between 0.62 and 124.6 grays. That is the difference between some vomiting, lower blood cell count, and impairment of the immune system with a high likelihood of survival to near instant death. At 0.62 grays per second, it would take just over 2 minutes of exposure to immediately lose consciousness and die within 24 hours. Unfortunately, it seems this was the exact fate of the 2 workers who were trapped in the collapse. But the bright side is that they didn't have to resort to cannibalism and turn into a grotesque rage monster, so winning, I guess. In-game, with no radiation resistance, the player dies in 2 seconds flat. Wow, that is quick, but also probably much quicker than real life. There are a few other quite radioactive areas in Fallout 76, such as the Federal Disposal Field, HZ-121, and some nuclear exhaust ports near some abandoned mines in the ash heap, which have higher peak radiation counts, but they're not quite as flashy, or cover an area nearly as large as a nuclear blast zone. The fissure sites are also radioactive, but at a more disappointing 49 rads per second, but it does have a lovely effect of insta-killing anyone who goes down and touches the beautiful green goo. Also, a special mention to the Pit Expedition, which has you exploring what is left of Pittsburgh not long after the war, and is the largest area with permanent radiation levels that can vary quite a bit, but don't reach the highest levels seen at Emmett Mountain. If you want to complement your stroll through Emmett Mountain with a spicy beverage, the toxic goo you get at the West Tech Research Center will hit you with a whopping 125 rads in one go. And there are an insane number of consumables that are radioactive in this game. If you think you know what the second place on this list will be, 99% of you are wrong. Sorry, it's just statistics. Don't take it personally. The second most radioactive place in the entire series is the positively glowing Vault 87 entrance. You thought that would be number one, didn't you? We will get to that in a second, but the entrance of Vault 87 is irradiated to an absolutely absurd degree. Vault 87 was initially meant to conduct research into an unknown project before scrapping those plans and pivoting towards FEV research instead. It became the source for super mutants in the Capital Wasteland, and although it's never stated directly why, the area just outside of the vault entrance is horrendously irradiated, like glowing piss, bone-aching levels of radiation. There is a sign near the entrance that seems to be pre-war in origin, since it is an industrial-type sign that is warning of radiation exposure, and even says that the annual radiation dose for a human will be reached in 0.5 seconds. And let's remember this for a little later. I don't really see why such a sign would be put up in the post-war, and why they would even bother to write in the amount of time it takes to get the annual exposure. I'm sure in the post-war world, the annual exposure is much higher than the pre-war as well. So if this was erected in the pre-war, what could have possibly caused all this radiation? At the absolute peak of the radiation, I measured a maximum of 3,933 rads per second, although some have claimed to get over 4,000. The hottest spot is several yards away from the entrance proper, but for the adventurous among you, the entrance does have a few surprises. The vault cannot be opened from this entrance, sealed either on purpose or as a result of time and decay, with a number of skeletons holding suitcases strewn about. Interestingly, there is also a deceased scientist in a radiation suit, so it seems we are not the only ones that find this hotspot interesting. It's just too bad that she didn't have access to console commands. 3,933 rads per second is nearly 4 grays, which that alone is enough exposure in 1 second to induce vomiting, fever, diarrhea, and emaciation for up to 2 days. The long-term prognosis also is not good, with hair loss, bone marrow damage, and internal bleeding being the result, with a fatality rate of 50% within 6 weeks. And that is just from 1 second of exposure. It would only take 20 seconds to go into the theoretical territory where it's believed one would suddenly lose consciousness and die within 24 hours. In the game with no radiation protection, you die within less than half a second. Dear Adam above, there isn't anything you could do in that amount of time to save your life. So back to that sign that spoke about the annual allowable radiation level. That level is 5 rems, which, depending on the radiation level, can equal just a straight 5 rads. 5 rads a year. At the most radioactive spot, we hit that limit in 0.3 milliseconds. Yowza. So that sign at the beginning that mentions the annual dose being achieved in 0.5 seconds is off by a factor of 3. I know I had said that the Emmett Mountain site was the third most irradiated before, and you know what? I lied to you. And I liked it. Since we are going by game, that wasn't really truthful, since Fallout 3 also technically has the third most irradiated place in the wasteland that we know of, and it is in the Pit DLC. Yes, I mentioned this when talking about Fallout 76, but the pit is monstrously irradiated, and that serves a key plot point in the Pit DLC, where it is discovered that a baby has been blessed with Adam's gift and is immune to radiation. The Monongahela River flows beneath a bridge that is crossed shortly after the beginning of the game in order to enter the pit. If you jump down into the water and go east, which you can only do with console commands, there will be a hotspot that maxes out at 2,665 rads per my observations. Another honorable mention is what happens if you decide to activate the Gecko inside Vault 87 instead of taking it like the main quest wants you to. After navigating through 3 different menus, again, the game really doesn't want you to activate it, a blast of energy will knock the player down and they'll be unable to get back up. The amount of radiation isn't nearly as high as the other places, but being unable to move means that you eventually succumb to the 80 to 140 rads per second that you get after activating it. Also, the pit introduced the most irradiated food item, the incredibly named slop, which is made from trog meat, which are just hideously mutated humans and is a part of a balanced breakfast. And so we have made it to the #1 spot, and it is going to require a little explaining, but hear me out. The most irradiated place in the entire Fallout series isn't the Crater of Adam or anywhere in the irradiated fog on Far Harbor. It is actually the reactor room in the Mass Fusion building. Mass Fusion was one of the major power suppliers to Boston and the surrounding areas, but they do not use fusion to do it, like their name implies. They were fooling people into thinking they were getting clean fusion power, when in reality they were still using fission to generate electricity. Behind the curtain, however, they were actually trying to create a viable fusion process and had a breakthrough when they created the beryllium agitator. But before they were able to capitalize on this success, the Great War erupted across the globe. The main quest will take you to this location when siding with the Institute, or the Brotherhood of Steel, and the main item of interest is that agitator, which will require you to enter the reactor room. There's actually not much background radiation here unless you decide to jump into the water below, but even those radiation levels aren't all that impressive, just at 45 rads per second. None of the machinery appears to be radioactive, and neither does that bright blue beam, although it will definitely insta-kill you if you touch it. So why is this the most radioactive place in the series? Well, if, in the course of fighting through levels of enemies and robots, you find yourself a little thirsty in the reactor room and decide to take a quick drink from the water below, that will be the last thing you do. But, and this is a big but, the thing that is killing you when you drink the water is not any special sort of toxic substance, it is radiation. The only way that we can uncover this is by using one of my favorite clothing items, the robes of Adam's Devoted. These special robes have a unique attribute where the more irradiated one is while wearing them, the greater your radiation resistance. This has what is possibly an unintended consequence, but maybe the developers meant to do this, where you can fully irradiate yourself without dying. Fallout 4 had changed the radiation system, where your radiation level caps your health, and if you get too irradiated, you'll have no more HP, and with no HP, you die. So this is cool for a lot of reasons, and I have a whole Child of Adam build video that uses the robes and shows all the stuff you can do when you are filled with Adam's holy glow. And if you're interested in that, go watch the video. All that matters here is that once you are fully irradiated, you cannot die from radiation exposure, although it does look like you have no health. So put on the robes, irradiate yourself fully, and go down to the water to drink. Rather than instantly dying like before, you briefly get hit with rads, and it is so much that it maxes out our Geiger counter. We take an astonishing 9,999 rads in 1 second, although it's impossible to say if the true value is higher or not. Maybe if we had a dosimeter that had a higher threshold, we could know for sure, and this whole thing is giving me major Chernobyl vibes, but let's just use that 9,000 rad figure. That would be a gray dosage of between 10 and 2,000 grays. Since we are ingesting the water, this is the one location that has the highest likelihood of dosing us with alpha radiation, which normally cannot penetrate the skin and must be brought into the body through some other means like ingestion. You know, the thing we just did. At 10 grays per second, it would take 8 seconds to hit that 80 gray level that would knock us unconscious. But the fact that we just straight up fall down completely dead, like my hopes of ever buying a house, leads me to believe that the rad count is much higher, and we are just limited by the Geiger counter display. Alternatively, maybe the rad count is correct, but it's all alpha radiation, and so the actual REMs are way higher. This actually could make sense since swimming in the water is only 45 rads, but ingesting it is way more. What is really interesting too is that if you wear the robes of Atoms Devoted and don't completely irradiate yourself before you drink the water, it will actually kill you, even though the robes should keep you from dying to radiation damage. I tested the blue beam to see if it was also radiation that insta-kills us, and sadly it's not. That one seems to be just straight up damage. Boo. The amount of time it takes to die from this radiation level is instantaneous. As soon as the drinking animation is done and the rads are applied, you're dead, unless you have Atom's Holy Protection. Some honorary Fallout 4 mentions are Hugo's Hole, which is the hideout of a raider that has been booby-trapped with a number of things, including some radioactive barrels. The USS Democracy that is located inside the nucleus on the island. The most radioactive part of the sub are the ICBM tubes that house the nuclear warheads, which are also the most radioactive location in the entire nucleus. The crater of Atom should be quite radioactive, but I could only ever measure a peak of 16 rads per second and a small hotspot of 19 if you clip beneath the surface. Oh, and the most radioactive of all consumables can be enjoyed thanks to the Far Harbor DLC, which are the sludge packs. There are several kinds that can increase stats like agility or damage resistance, delivering a whopping 150 rads in one dose, which is the highest of any consumable in the game, and it will deliver a stat increase that is relative to how much radiation you currently have, making them super powerful when coupled with my Child of Atom build. There are Fallout's most irradiated places. It is fun to see how the Bethesda games, generally speaking, are much more radioactive than Interplay and Obsidian, and Fallout 3 has more super high radiation locations than any other game. I would love to hear your comments on this, and big thanks to my patrons, and especially my two new patrons, Sydney H and Alex Owensby, whose support helped me make videos like this, which I had a really fun time running around in-game and investigating. If you would like to show me support, check out the video description. Walk in Atom's holy light. Take care of yourselves, please. And I will see you soon.